I mean, I'm just waiting for it to like become a package on Kali Linux, and then Cybrary can just get hit by this IoT bot device. That'll be a fun day for me, I bet.
Yeah, I don't know
this
what
is
you
really
do
taking a
about it.
turn. Welcome to the Cybrary podcast.
Well, welcome back.
Welcome back.
Welcome back.
Welcome.
Welcome back.
Welcome.
Well, welcome back.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Ryan Corey, CEO and co-founder of Cybrary, and I'm excited for you to join us on today's episode. Let's jump in.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Cybrary podcast. I'm Jonathan Myers, Principal Infrastructure Engineer here at Cybrary. And today we have a special guest, Matt Dunlop, who is the Chief Information Security Officer at Under Armour, and returning guest, Josh Lospinoso, co-founder at Shift5, and of course, Mike Gruen, VP of Engineering at Cybrary. Hey, guys, how's everybody doing today? If we can go around do introductions real quick. Matt, we'll start with you, and then we'll kind of do quick recaps on Josh and Mike.
Yeah, doing well, Jonathan. Good to see you. I haven't seen you in a while now. Good to see the beards going well. The haircut has gone a little bit shorter than last time I remember, but but I'm sure it's probably the COVID cut in the mirror with the scissors.
Yeah, and I have another haircut this afternoon, so it'll be even shorter, except on the top. We keep that long because, well, I keep it about as long as I kept it as a cadet, I think.
Mine was like that last week.
Yeah.
Mine was like that last week, but I decided, to trim it up for this.
All right. So Matt, do you want to explain kind of what you do at Under Armour, like where the CISO kind of fits in, and then we have a couple topics planned and we'll go through that.
Yeah, sure. So of course, the CISO does normal things you expect a CISO to do at a company, especially a retail company. But what's interesting, is in addition to just being responsible for, corporate security, across all our global offices, it's also, the retail globally. But more interesting is the connected fitness side of the business, which most people don't even realize we own. The MyFitnessPal application, the MapMyFitness, the Endomondo. So it's security of course, all the corporate retail, and then all the connected fitness applications. And so lots of different unique experiences to manage.
Nice. And then just for some background for the audience, Matt, Josh, and I were all happened to be at the United States Military Academy at West Point at one point. I think Matt was my senior, I don't know what capstone advisor, if you will. Yeah. And then Josh was just there writing papers, not doing things that cadets do. And then, we traveled a bunch. Thanks, Josh.
Josh was one of my cadets I took to West Point, or to NSA one summer as a summer internship.
Yeah, and then so we all kind of intersected, and then Mike's the lone guy out. But Mike has worked with myself and Josh for the last 5 years almost now. And then Josh,
sounds about right. And Josh
8?
was a little bit longer. Yeah.
Yep.
I think it was 2012-ish, I think. Yeah.
I just have to tell a story about Josh before we start. Is I remember when we first went to the NSA, and 3 days into it or something, Josh had written some 14-page paper that he presented in front of all the NSA, and he's like, "Any questions?" And General Alexander goes, "Yeah, are there any more like you?" So I have to tell that story because Josh won't tell that story.
Yeah, I have a similar Josh story about the that one car ride that we did all the way down to DC for the Undersecretary of Defense, where we got the flat tire and the NPS students, the Naval Postgraduate School students that were presenting their 2 years of work. And you were just like, nope.
So wait, today's episode is all about just Josh Lospinoso stories, because I got a bunch. Oh, okay.
Jonathan Myers was also the president of HKN, the Honor Society, and which was as well as he had a number of publications as a cadet, which is not that common for undergraduate student back then.
Yeah, compared to Josh's 100, I had 2 or 3.
Let's be real. It was all about being able to get away from West Point for a week to go hang out at an academic conference.
All right. So great segue into our first topic. So Matt, you did a lot of your PhD research and then research throughout the course of your career kind of in IP6 security, or do you want to kind of give a brief description of like what that gamut spanned real quick, and then we'll kind of dive in?
Yeah. So when I went to do the PhD, I was, I would say I was initially motivated by, I didn't want to get up in front of my, my dissertation committee at my defense and have somebody say, that research has already been done, and then go back to square one. So I decided to do my research on IPv6 since nobody cared about it, and frankly, it doesn't look like people care today. But anyway, so I went to Virginia Tech for that because Virginia Tech actually had a campus-wide v6 deployment, which is actually pretty cool because that meant that any work we did, we got to deploy on the live network and test it out. And so we were starting to look at areas we could do research on that were kind of unique, and we noticed that the way they did their addressing used what was called the stateless address auto configuration, or SLAC, and it basically took for the host portion of the address, it took the MAC address, split it in the middle, put FFFE in it, and that was your host portion across every network you joined. So of course we were thinking, hey, we could track somebody as they move throughout a geographic area by just doing a ping script of all the subnets of that area. And so we were like, well, that's not very good for privacy. And so then we started to look at how can we dynamically obscure that portion of the address to protect the user from being able to be tracked. And then kind of exploded from there, and we started thinking, hey, this is actually a really good security technique in the sense that, if you're constantly rotating addresses, you can't launch a sustained denial of service attack, a sustained TCP hijack, or any of a number of different layer 3 or layer 4 attacks. And so it ended up being that's where the direction we went, was more security and privacy. But we were able to develop a strategy that was able to rotate addresses mid session without having to re-handshake. And so we, long story short, we patented it. I think they've actually been future work or some subsequent work on it since I left, on streamlining the protocol and making it so that it could be moved to mobile devices and even used in cloud environments. So I think there's been a lot of work done on it since then, but that was the basis of the work anyway.
Sounds kind of similar to like frequency hopping.
It is, exactly. That's exactly how we described it, was frequency hopping in the IP space. And the interesting part about it was, people always ask, well, what about collisions, or what about address space? Well, the address space wasn't a problem because it was, your address space was 2 to the 64. So even if you had 1 million hosts on your subnet, your chances of a collision are still statistically 0. And then if there was that odd chance of a collision, the only thing that would happen would be that that one hop those packets would have to be transmitted. And if they were UDP, you didn't care about them anyway, so it didn't matter.
And what year was this? Just some context into it.
It was 2012. So 8 years ago, and we were all pretty excited at the time because they had sold the last block of IPv4 addresses, and we were like, oh, it's any day now. This is becoming, our patent's we're going to make tons of money off this, and it's now 2020, and nobody still uses IPv6 except for the Chinese and the French.
Is there money on which comes first, quantum computers, or IPv6?
I guess an interesting thing is they're kind of starting to take that, right? So Apple in iOS 14 now does randomized MAC addresses. So I think that kind of how does that kind of, I know it doesn't compare at all, but it seems like we're kind of moving that way. How does that kind of?
I would put my money on quantum computing. Well, so there were some privacy schemes that existed at the time, but they were all based on randomizing consistently. So it was a static randomization. So you'd either have the same address regardless of what subnet you went to, or you'd have a predictable address on different subnets. And so so you could still track somebody by that, whereas we were using in addition to a secret key, we were using a nonce. So it was truly randomized, but I think you're seeing one of the unique things is I think you're actually going to see IPv6 stand up more in underdeveloped countries than you're going to in mainstream countries, because part of the challenge, and this is a part of the challenge I think we've all seen with technology, is it's financially driven. It doesn't behoove the US to transition from IPv4 because it's expensive. So we're looking for any strategy we can to delay that transition. Whereas if you're a new country that had never really developed, you can't afford to buy the IPv4 addresses, and all devices are native IPv6 now. So you could just stand up an IPv6 network. It doesn't, it's cheap because you don't have to pay much for the addresses. And so I think you're going to see more explosion of IPv6 out of those regions.
Also, like, let's see, leapfrog ahead. I mean, that's where, it's not just what's cheaper now, but also if I was building a city, thousands of years ago, it wouldn't have indoor plumbing. I'm building a city now. Indoor plumbing is going to be, and sewage and the rest of it. So as those underdeveloped countries are now developing and jumping, they can sort of leapfrog over some of the stuff that we've done, and have, sort of be ahead. Whereas it's going to cost us a lot of money to upgrade to get to that point. So I can see that from that perspective too.
Yeah, and I still think you're still going to see just the Internet of Things continues to explode. It's inevitable that we're not going to be able to just maintain network address translation to be able to handle the IP load as everything gets internet enabled.
Right.
I say that as I just put out a refrigerator and freezer sensor in my garage freezer because I didn't feel like it was keeping consistent temperature.
I was just going to say that conversation around rotating MAC addresses reminds me of like how even when we're designing new protocols, I wonder whether we're not just like falling into the same traps. So like Bluetooth Low Energy, they all have these device IDs, right? Which are like essentially similar to MAC addresses. And at least the microcontrollers I've messed with, like they don't set new Bluetooth Low Energy device IDs. So like it's the same sort of tracking problem over again, right? And yeah, so I don't know if we're learning our lesson.
Well, it's an ID. It's not supposed to change.
I don't know. My favorite was all the IPv4 research where you saw that every researcher wanted to reuse those unused 7 bits in the header, to where eventually they were overloaded about 27 times.
I wonder if it's even like, I wonder if it was like an actual trade-off that somebody like made that discussion, right? Because technically, theoretically, most IoT devices are all going behind some sort of NAT like router or like home thing. And so it's like, does it really matter if it's super unique and things like that? I mean, I wonder like what is the engineering cost on that's probably minuscule, right? Or I guess, no, it probably requires processing power. And as you're like building these IoT devices,
Exactly.
you're like, oh, I need battery. I got to run this off battery. Like, why would I waste a couple cycles on battery?
Yeah, especially if it's going over RF, right? So like if you've got to broadcast the BLE ID every time you transmit a message, if you've got, I think it's like 48 bits or something. If you're doing 128 instead of 48, that's like pretty substantial overhead when it's a tiny message, So yeah, it's just like, it's one of these things we're seeing in a lot of contexts is we'll learn all these lessons on the IT side and build security in finally. But then like when it comes to a new context, we're building, tiny computers and they're going into operational technology or whatever. We just like make the same mistakes over again and then have to like go back and patch them 10 years later when it becomes a huge problem.
It's even not as much a technology decision as a cost decision at the time. I think people recognize the fact that security needs to be there, but it's too expensive to put in. It's like everyone remembers the Blueborn attack that basically affected every Bluetooth device, and most of the Bluetooth devices you couldn't upgrade the firmware. So the advice was, turn them off when not in use. Well, what the heck kind of advice is that? That's horrible advice. And especially if you're thinking about, things like insulin pumps and pacemakers. I'm like, you're not turning those off. So I think, as we read more and more about cyber attacks happening everywhere and every day, we've got to stop with this mentality of let's just get the cheapest product out and actually think about, upgradability and security and things like that should have been in the design to begin with.
Yeah, but I think the issue becomes, like, especially a lot of these companies that, if you take like the traditional model of the last like 5 years, right? Like a startup develops this IoT device, throws it on Kickstarter, and like gets it out the door. They're not, I would say they're probably the first 100 people they hire are not security people. And so it's like, as the developer's making the MVP, he's like, oh, well, we can put that in later if he even thought about it. But chances are he probably didn't even think about it. And so he just like, I have this experience with certain devs, right? Like they hard code a nonce because they're like, I don't want to import this library to be able to do this correctly. Like it broke some dependency somewhere in my thing. Let's just hard code the nonce. And so like they make these changes. And it's like, you don't find out until like, I think it was a couple months later, when you're doing like a code scan and you're like, oh, like, why is this set to a static string? Like, I don't understand. And so I think, especially if like a security guy's not your first 100 hire, like when would you catch this? And it's like, oh, well, the firmware is already out there. And then I have never worked in this industry, but I'm sure remote patching firmware is one of the most stressful things ever, especially like early on before you have like super hardcore testing and things like that. Like I'd be afraid to do an deployment, like, right? Because if you brick it, like that's it.
And that is one of the key considerations on the AppSec side is, and why, a lot of tech debt is so hard to roll out, because people look at the and I think this is probably the case across the board is the series of libraries that are involved in the initial code for any type of application. And your struggle is just to stay within, compliance, just to stay within, libraries that are still being serviced or still, not deprecated yet. Because what you end up with is every time you roll out a new library update is you have to think about all the dependencies that might break. And of course, if you're running, a global application that has hundreds of millions of users, you can't afford to have a library patch take down your entire app.
Yeah, and I would say that's like a full-time job. Like even at a small company that's just running, like, say, Cybrary, right? Like that could be a full-time job for somebody, is just keeping up with a lot of these like dependency trees and stuff. Like thankfully there's like a lot of tools these days that kind of like help you through that. But like at the end of the day, it all comes down to, I think, is like how much time as the security person have to go spelunking through GitHub repos to verify like a dependency that's 12 levels deep, right? Like that takes some time.
Yeah, it's impossible. I mean, I know in this ecosystem we're seeing a lot of activity. So there's some big companies like Sneak and Black Duck that are doing these like dependency scanning things for your applications. And like I've just had a couple of observations about that space. One is, I think we're still at the whitelist blacklist phase of that like kind of cybersecurity product getting built. Like we're still very early days, because like if you have somebody that slips in an unknown malicious bit of code into a dependency 3 levels down, like you're not going to catch that with these products, right? And so like I think there's a lot of room for us to grow there. And the second thing is there's just I don't know if NPM is a particularly egregious offender of this, but like if you've looked at like NPM node applications, just even pulling in React or something that's like a really simple like framework, between the dev dependencies and the runtime dependencies, you're talking about 8,000 packages. I mean, it's just like, it's absurd. And there's no way that a single person, even full time, could go through all those dependencies and like scan them for malware, or vulnerabilities like every time you need to deploy your application. So I think this is going to be one of the big frontiers of cybersecurity that we're going to see.
Well, I think you also, there's statistics out there that say that for every 1,000 lines of code, there's between 15 and 50 errors. And so that's, frightening when you think about how many lines of code go into some of these applications. But even more troubling is, just the tendency to bring on a third party, API integration for things you don't want to do yourself. Like, hey, it's not in my wheelhouse to do frame representation in a streaming application or whatever else, and so I'm going to go to this company that does it. Well, you do that enough times, and then you look to your left and right, and how many third-party applications do you have in your in your entire application stack, and then you start thinking about the cascading errors, and if one of those companies, who's probably some small company, has an issue, whose name is it in the paper? Is it that small company who nobody knows? It comes back to, for me, I always keep remembering this one last year, the LabCorp and Quest Diagnostics breach that happened. If you look under the hood, it was neither Quest Diagnostics or LabCorp that got breached. It was APCA, but nobody knew APCA, so nobody cared. So the press pinned it on LabCorp and Quest Diagnostics.
And that's if the culprit is even a corporation, right? Like these days you use so many open source frameworks with basically anonymous committers. Like you may think as a corporation that you've got some sort of software that you develop, but like in reality, when you look at the code that's running on the machines that you're deploying, like a really small subset of that code is actually code that your developers wrote.
Yeah, and I came from the opposite, right? When I started, I was doing C++, and C, actually C, CGI is it was 97, 98. So our ability to build everything was based on what we ourselves could code. Like there were no libraries. We had to strings. I remember when we went to Java and we're like, wow, there's Java util. This is amazing. We don't have to handle linked lists, and
you don't have to write a linked list. Yeah,
exactly. And that was, so empowering. It's what's gotten us to where we are, is that, right, Cybrary, we have, a very small dev team because they focus on that small percentage of code that is in their wheelhouse. And we essentially outsource everything else to libraries. And right. So there's this whole risk. It's very, it's very, for me, because I'm both the VP of engineering and head of security, I see both sides of it, and it's really tough. And the thing that I always keep in mind is the same thing that drove me at Red Owl, which is I never want to see our company on the front page of the, New York Times or Washington Post or whatever, as being some sort of either breached or the source of some other company's breach, which would have been more the case at Red Owl.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's definitely, a struggle. And I think you're right, Josh. That's the emerging place, right? There's no going back. We have to build on top of what we've built upon, There's no, I'm just going to hire up a huge engineering team and do this myself. The build versus buy, if it's free, the buy decision is pretty easy. So now it's right. How do you make that decision as low risk as possible?
Yeah. And it's, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Matt.
Funny as because Josh brought up the open source and how we're leveraging open source libraries, and so you see businesses spin out of that, so now there's a whole area of vendors that are coming out with software composition analysis that are designed to point out vulnerabilities in open source code. So it's just it's funny how these things all propagate, self-propagating.
Totally. Yeah. And to your point, G, I think it's the extremes they have to be wrong, right? If you're writing everything from scratch, using the C runtime, you're never going to get, your company's just never going to be productive. But then
yeah, we can all agree that is empty or is null or whatever it was that was
is
the
odd.
one that
is
right,
odd. Yeah.
right. Whatever it was that was being brought in by every library because writing an if statement was too hard.
That was left pad.
Was it left pad? I can't even remember. Yeah. It was right. There's definitely a bounce. Yeah.
But I think you shouldn't be writing your own crypto libraries. To kind of an earlier part of the conversation. If I think abstracting out I need to do I need to hash this message with a key, and then basically making smart decisions around what are the defaults for that, so that you're not messing something up that's critical, but kind of hard for a non-crypto person to understand, or God forbid, rolling your own crypto. We should definitely be using third-party libraries for that kind of stuff. But there's where's the gray, there's a gray area in the middle. So I don't know, maybe part of engineering has to be, regularly reviewing the dependencies that you've brought in for a release and like having a conversation, maybe it's a cross-functional conversation with like the security guys to say like, hey, here's a list of the stuff that we've brought in. Like, do you have any objections to this? Or, I don't know what the right answer is, but
that meeting's never going to happen, but sorry, Matt, go on.
I think part of the challenge is having is going back to the underlying operating system or the underlying platform that it rides on, and how that is handling the different integrations. Because, I fully believe that, you gain a lot of value and efficiency from leveraging a company that's what they do. I mean, that's their bread and butter. But then you have things like, iOS and cascading permissions. If you grant permissions to the camera roll, you're essentially granting permission to every third-party app that might leverage the camera roll, which you may not want to grant those permissions or may not even need to.
Yeah, and I think they're getting better. Like, I think finally the privacy and those types of things, like at least in like the iOS and the mobile ecosystems, are kind of raising that bar, right? Like especially iOS 14 now, like does that like, do you want this app to like ad track you type situation, which is gonna stop a lot of that random stuff. But yeah, I think that's kind of raising the bar. But what I'm kind of wondering is like, how do we, because like I would say IoT is probably one of the greater attack vectors that we're probably gonna just get hit in the face with in the next 5-10 years. It's like, how do we get them to start doing things better, right? Because I think it's super weird, because if you think about it from like a securities perspective, like 10 years ago, if somebody would have said, hey, take this box and just plug it into your network, right? You'd have been like, no. Like, there's no doubt in my mind that you would have just said like, no, I'm not going to take this random box and just plug it in, right? And so we've kind of gotten to that place where it's like everybody has their own home network, and it's like everything connects to the internet, and you just buy it and you take it home and you just put it on your network, right? Like, we're not all super networking gurus like Mike, who has like 9 different VLANs separated by physical routers and wears a tinfoil hat. Like, the average consumer is just taking box and plugging it in. And how do you start to like get these IoT devices up to a specific level, or, maybe there's like a rating or some sort of like privacy thing that kind of goes along with it, because like all of this security stuff exists, right? Like, if you look
You have
at
to hold
how
them
we're gonna
liable. I
operate-
mean, just to jump in, I mean, you need to, I think we've
Yeah.
had this conversation, right? Like, the motivation is always financial, right? And so there's got to be some sort of, if these, it's sort of the best practices. If you're not adhering to best practices and you're allowing these things to happen, then there needs to be some sort of liability. That's one way. It's not the only way, but we've seen, at least in the US, that money tends to be the big motivator, which means regulations and legislation and other things that, most of us don't really want more of, but like, that's what I think moves the needle for a lot of companies. That's just
I think, and I'm not even clear how you do this, but I think one really promising way would be like educating consumers. So in other words, if the person that's buying the device is like discerning, you can create like a market for having a bar for your security. I don't know. I mean, I think to some extent, maybe it's just because I'm a security enthusiast, but I think some of the, press around Apple, emphasizing user privacy and things like whether, you agree with that or not is totally separate conversation. But I think that they branded themselves really well as protecting user privacy. I think that has become a competitive differentiator for them. There's certainly like some set of consumers that really value that property of Apple products. And so, I wonder whether at some point we can educate consumers enough so that they know, like, they're not going to buy an IoT device that has a reputation, from a manufacturer that has a reputation for not really caring at all about, security or like actively like subverting user privacy or whatever. I don't know. I feel like that's got to be the answer at the end of the day, because everything else is sort of like, regulation and things that are hard to enforce. Whereas, the market speaks with its moving feet. So to use a mixed metaphor.
I think you probably could have stopped that last conversation with educate the consumer. Because, that's one of the problems. I mean, there is, we're putting technology in the hands of 3-year-olds and we do nothing, absolutely nothing throughout their educational journey to teach them how to use any of it. We say, have a nice day. Good luck. Best to you.
I mean, and you talk about educating the consumer, but look at the Huawei 5G rollout. Like that was like nations and corporations that like didn't do their due diligence to see like, oh, they're siphoning off data or like things like that. Like if we can't expect them, right? Like those, you would assume some of the people demoing those systems are technical experts in their field, right? Like I don't know if we can expect the average consumer, especially the rate at which these devices are kind of coming to market. I do think one way is kind of, it's like a weird backwards, but I think Apple might be able to kind of push it. I think it was like Apple, Google, and somebody else created this like smart home alliance or whatever to kind of standardize on protocols. And I think as those, I think we've all kind of agreed, like the HomeKit, the Google Home or whatever, and then I guess Amazon has their Alexa enabled. Like those are kind of the frameworks that everybody's starting to play into. And I think maybe if those alliances step up and start putting in these types of controls to be like, in order for you to be HomeKit enabled, like your security has to be at this level, or they start building it into like the HomeKit control, right? So like the Apple TV that controls all these HomeKit things kind of says like, oh, here's where we draw the line. And it almost becomes like, to put it in, I guess, easy context, like an iOS device, like requesting permissions on your network per IoT device. And so you can be like, yes, my Alexa does not need to be able to scan for devices on my network, like all of these types of things. And so I think that could be an interesting way to kind of push it, because I don't think the consumer education thing, I think it's growing too fast, right? And I would say after you reach a certain age in your life, like you're just not able to pick up things as fast when it comes to technology. And so you're already behind on like how like an Alexa works. And so now you're going to add in another layer of like, oh, this other competitor, are they as secure or things like that?
I mean, I think it's interesting. So my skeptical mind immediately, when you start talking about an alliance of, Google, Amazon, Alexa, the rest of them, that's just raising the barrier to entry for other people to play in that space by doing this thing, right? Like there might be some benefit to the consumer, but basically what they're saying is we're the only ones who are allowed to spy on you. That's just where my head goes, because I wear that tinfoil hat Jonathan alluded to earlier. But I do agree. I mean, I think there's some definite, like if we can get like, look at Apple, right? If they source their devices and the components and everything else from good places, then so on and so forth, and you can sort of build up. And so it's also not just about it's the device manufacturers, but those devices, there's a whole logistics of smaller devices and smaller devices. Look at a car. Josh can probably speak a lot better to this than I can, but all of the devices that are in a car and making sure that those are adhering to good security. And I'm sure there's going to be companies that can sort of trade on that name and we'll take it seriously. And so it's not so much about educating the consumer as much as maybe really touting your ability to be in there. And I think as more hacks and more problems occur, I mean, people are going to take it more seriously. It's going to be the point at which, it's just raising awareness more than education. People are now more aware of, say, what happens in Facebook and how Facebook operates than they were a bunch of years ago. I've never had a Facebook account. I've always known those things. It's why I wasn't there. And I think just more things happen, more news. And so I guess it is a little bit about educating people.
So you're implying that the CAN bus in a vehicle isn't the best isolation network?
Oh, we've had that discussion so many times.
That's old hat around here.
So, I mean, like it would be interesting because I think, especially with all the new connected car products and things like that, I wonder if it's going to come to a point where it's like you basically buy an add-on for your car that like plugs into the old school port that just like adds a layer of security into your car, right? Like
I might know someone who's starting a company, something like that.
This is a
that sounds really
idea,
interesting.
guys.
That seems like a great company idea.
Josh, do you know anything about that?
We could like, it would be like intrusion detection, but for like OT, right? Man, someone should patent that, I think.
But I think it'd be interesting.
Great idea. You should start a company on that, Josh.
Yeah,
Well,
because
I mean, we did skip over this part of the. I mean, we started talking about haircuts before we got a chance to actually introduce Josh and what his company does. So, for those who maybe haven't tuned into previous episodes, they might be a little lost at this point. So, Josh, do you want to just give a quick why we're giving you
Sure.
crap?
Yeah. So Shift 5 is a company I co-founded 2 years ago, and we make an intrusion detection system for we call it planes, trains, and tanks, so that our grandparents can tell their friends what we do. But yeah, it turns out you can hack OT, operational technology, like a train or a tank or a vessel or military systems, and that's pretty bad. And you should, we think it's important to put security products in place to try to keep that from happening.
I was just trying to think about what I could say about that, because I did work with Josh's other co-founders on a project similar to that when I was still in the military. And
we have hands-on experience
yes,
from all aspects of the life cycle of these.
That it is a significant problem that needs to be solved.
Yeah, there's actually the Government Accountability Office put out a report that's unclassified. So I pretty much only talk about details that are in there, but you can just download on the internet. They'll tell you how bad the problem is with military platforms.
Oh, I should look that up, and then I can figure out what I can talk about.
Yeah. They have this vaguely looking fighter bomber stealth aircraft thing that they just they call a military platform, and
So, kind of around that is, I wonder, so, take Tesla, for example, right? They reinvented the car for the most part, but, did they spend any extra time on those types of, systems, or were they doing, a trade-off analysis? Oh, this stuff kind of works. People don't really know how it works. We build the bare minimum there and spend all of our R&D money into batteries, drivetrains, that type of thing. I wonder if that kind of concept came up because they were just, I don't know if that juice is worth the squeeze at this point. And so,
yeah. So they have a really I think avant-garde security perspective. So they can pretty regularly donate Model 3s to hack the car kind of events where they'll allow security researchers to try to penetrate the security on the system. From my recollection, it's typically focused around the sort of infotainment system and the remote access components of it, which is obviously a hugely important part of it. Unfortunately, just going back to sort of protocols having fundamental issues, and what Matt was alluding to with CAN buses, they are single collision domain. There's no security built in. It's a fundamental protocol problem. So there's really only so much you can do unless you're willing to just completely reinvent how serial communications work in an OT system. So, I'm not aware of whether they put intrusion detection systems on the serial data buses, sort of the control lines of the car. But I do know that they've done a pretty good job from what I can tell on the sort of IT side of it, the Ethernet switch side.
So I think where this problem, if I can predict the future, is going to rear its head, right? So fast forward, I think 5 years, maybe 10 years, right? Where autonomous vehicles are just driving around, picking people up, dropping them off, and nobody is in the car outside of the passenger. I now have physical access to this car that's probably not mine, right? It probably is talking back to a bunch of company servers that's managing the fleet and things like that. How do you, you're going to need some sort of intrusion prevention system, or at the least detection system, that's going to be able to basically kill that car's internet connection and take it offline and things like that. And I think maybe there are smart people out there thinking about this, but I think that day is coming a lot sooner than we have started to think about, right? Because we kind of do it with planes. Planes, aircraft systems are pretty hardcore solid with all the testing and all the physical access type stuff to prevent things like that now. I wonder how many incidences it will take for an autonomous car for somebody to like, oh, well, I popped the dash, I plugged in.
I'm curious
and like,
though
now
about
I have the car.
Although
my
if you
understanding on
use-
airplanes is that that's not actually the case. That
No,
you can
because if
pull
you
panels.
clearly if you use your Bluetooth device during takeoff or landing, that thing's going down.
Right, but I'm saying at least like the software they chose that like runs the aircraft systems is not using like Node or like some of these modern frameworks, right? Like it's all written in as my professor from West Point will tell me, ADA 95, right? Like it's written in these very low level languages that like it's a lot harder to exploit. Whereas like you take a Tesla and you look at the infotainment system, like I'm pretty sure that's running what, Node or like some other sort of like modern web framework that has all these
Probably
dependencies.
Android, right? Yeah. It's
Yeah,
probably
and
Android.
so it's a little bit the attack surface is probably a lot greater on these cars, right? And especially if like somebody's in a car they don't own, they can pop in a thing and it's like, oh, well, now I own this car because like you can't talk to it, you can't control it, it's not going to tell you where it's at. Chop chop,
Totally.
gone.
Yeah, I mean, I just think like we have to learn lessons from the past, and so when you think about how you defend an enterprise network, there's all there's so many facts. I mean, this is Matt knows more about this than and Mike know more about this than anybody as CISOs. It's like you have all of these different components of the system, and you have to think about how your security measures like nest together. And where I think we are on a lot of this IoT or OT security is we're starting in it's good. We're like, we've got attention to it. We're starting to put security measures in place, but like things like monitoring, we're just not there yet. It's just like I'm reminded of like the old thing, like obstacles are only good as long as they're monitored, right? Like the so I think you just need belt and suspenders. You need to do all of these things. You got to try and mitigate risks where they are. You have to put security measures in place, and then you also have to monitor things and for unknown unknowns.
So Josh is going back to my old command engineer days. we're really in minefields. But and that's the point that you're making about the old network defense. You've seen that shift in strategy from the what I like to call the Tootsie Pop defense, the hard outer shell in the GUI center, to just isolating as much as you can, and that hasn't happened on the vehicle side at all. And so well, I would say it's still operating under the Tootsie Pop defense, but it's actually just there's no hard outer shell. It's just a GUI.
That's right. The hard outer shell is the literal shell. Like it's like whatever.
It's actually just a Tootsie Roll. It's a Tootsie Roll defense.
That's right. But I think more and more people are realizing, everyone's heard the adage, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And so you try and isolate portions of your network as much as you can so that if the bad guy does get in, you really minimize the amount of damage they can do before you're able to mitigate that. And so, I think that has to happen across, everything, and I think, to kind of go back to a point that Jonathan made earlier with regard to, security being built in and consumers being, wiser to the security components of the things they buy. I think the problem is that consumers are shopping with their, from a financial perspective instead of a security or reliability. Not reliability, probably more, but less security. And so, I guarantee you, there's only a few of us that are going through as we're shopping for a new whatever and looking at, can you update the firmware? What security mechanisms are in place? What type of encryption is it using? Most other people are going, how many stars did it get and what was the price?
Definitely.
Yeah, and I think what's kind of, I think, scary, right? Like, is the rate we're adopting these physical devices, and then just like, we got to go back to the past, right? But if you look at like container security and like modern cloud stuff, right? Like we're still fighting that battle, right? Like containers kind of get that whole like, oh, well, let's sandbox this one isolated process so that if somebody gets in and things like that. But like we've only seen that in the last couple of years, and then
that's
now
actually interesting because I was going to bring that up is in the physical world, right? Like in the virtual world, in software, what we do, virtualization has really push things forward. We can put things into containers, and now this thing that maybe this developer wrote doesn't need to be quite as robust because we know we're putting it into this other thing that's going to, it's still has these, it's just shells.
We've come a
but
long
there's-
way since real mode operating systems, right?
Exactly. Right. Exactly. And so, but what's the equivalent in the hardware? There is a point at which it's just prohibitively
No,
expensive
they're
to take.
real mode operating systems.
Right. But I mean, like I could see, like in my naive view, I could see like, okay, well, we just take some components that run the old way. We put them inside a little box that does some sort of that its job is to take whatever that insecure protocol was, add the security to it. So the only insecure bit is between that little thing inside the box and then the container it's running in. And then we can put all these things in the cars and magic. Yeah. But the reality is that all of those containers are prohibitively expensive right now. So yeah, I don't know.
And it comes down to processing power and battery or power like consumption, right? Like totally. Just to do encryption, like you have to double, like if you're doing like an ARM thing, like just to get encryption on there, you just basically have to double the processing power of your thing that you needed pre-encryption.
I can't tell you how many like microcontrollers that I've like messed with that actually can't handle doing like a TLS handshake because it just would take them 10 minutes to like do the math.
So when I'm turning my car to the left, that would be bad?
That would be bad. Yeah.
And that is, the driving, that and the battery consumption are driving factors behind. In fact, there's been research that's even been able to tell when an attack is happening on a microcontroller by power output because you can see the battery consumption.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's like easy to get into a nihilistic place about all this because, the state of security is pretty bad. I think like there are a couple of things that are happening that make me at least a little bit like optimistic.
The stay-at-home orders? Is it the stay-at-home orders?
One thing is that there's just been a really like a huge boom in like the microcontroller market. And so we're seeing these like really incredibly powerful microcontrollers hitting the market that are pretty cheap. And like you're seeing more and more like kind of even what would normally be PCB design, just like hard circuits, like move into software on the microcontroller, which at first glance would seem even worse of a problem just given like how bad the security is. Like I actually think what we're going to see is just for developer productivity reasons, more and more of operating systems starting to exist on these microcontrollers, like more frameworks for like rapidly developing applications. And I think that sort of thing is actually really good for security because if you've got like sort of frameworks that allow developers to work at higher levels of abstraction, they don't have to worry about the details, and the details are where they get things wrong and they create security problems, right? So I think we're moving in the right direction. There's like this one company called Particle. I was messing around with this little IoT board. It's got like a CAN bus and like some like GPIO pins and things. And it's like, you actually can't write firmware for it. There's an operating system that sits on it. You like, dork around in your Arduino IDE and it sends code down that either like transpiles into or something, but it's like run in a harness. So it solves all the like the updating parts and like the telemetry and the uploading and certificates and everything. It's all managed for you. And so I think we'll start to see more of that just for productivity reasons. And in that sense, like I think like economic incentives and security could be aligned,
Yeah, and I think you can add like baseline security to stuff like that, right? Like when it boots, like let's do a checksum on like the boot image and things like that, where it's like you're killing attacks pretty early on and it kind of like just barely raises the bar. And so, but I mean, yeah.
That's why my car malware waits until you're going 30 miles an hour before it does anything.
That was funny. Those are some of the things we considered in some of the work we were doing.
Yep.
But as well as, a removable checksum, where, it's sort of like a key, and I guess it is a key, but I mean, like a physical key to where, you can't, because that was one of the issues too, is there was a possibility of manipulating the checksum so that, your malware would check.
Yeah. And what's doing the checking, right? Is it the,
yeah, right.
I mean, I think this is interesting. Do you think Apple's kind of leading the way almost in some of these things by the way they've kind of moved their chip development in-house and how they start to think about like secure elements and like all of those like fancy things they're now like baking into even the like chip on your watch, right? Like I think that's absolutely nuts how like secure Apple Pay is on your watch, because they have like certain elements that are basically hard coded off of certain paths because they're able to own the whole pipeline. I don't think any other chip manufacturer is at that level yet that can start to do that. But I think I don't know, maybe it's a fundamental shift in how people can start thinking about chip design now and developing these things. And we kind of get less software, more hardware type controls now that we're able to fit more and more stuff on smaller and smaller chips.
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely, I think you're right, Jonathan. Like, we've definitely seen huge progress on the hardware side for like security primitives. I mean, even if you just look at like the Intel instruction set, even like there are AES extensions in there because of a class of cyber attacks that like a bunch of researchers found about like timing and things. And so, you know, those got integrated. You're starting to see like, you know, trusted platform modules and all these sorts of things. So like, I definitely think like we're seeing a lot of progress where at the lowest level, things are getting more and more secured, you know?
On Apple, they've really have taken, I think probably the leading edge on just pushing security out. You know, you hear people complaining about it, but about some of the things that, you know, like the consistently getting reminded, hey, do you really want to still share this? You know, but you know, I think it's a move in the right direction. It's you know, making sure that that they're protecting the consumer's data. You know, and as we see more and more regulatory fines for data exposures, you know, I think everybody's going to start having to go that direction. So I'm pleased with the additional diligence that Apple's put toward security.
Yeah, and I think it gets back to like the educating the consumer, right? Like the consumer knows if they got a pop-up on their phone that it was like asking for their contacts, right? Where I would say 5 years ago, you would have just been like, yeah, sync my contacts. But now that it's almost like Windows, when Windows first did the, what is it, the UAC, I think as they call it, the little like command prompt that's like, oh, do you want to run this like thing that would take over your screen and cause you to like pause and look? I think now
He trusted that.
Yeah. But I think now like iOS and bringing it to like devices that you look at many, many, many times a day, kind of just raises that, because you're much more aware, I think, right? As opposed to just pushing something in an app where a developer kind of hid the feature into like a cool looking button, you know, and it's like, oh, I want to click that,
Yep.
you know, but now that it takes over everything, and it's like, oh, I have to like, I can't do anything else here until I agree or disagree. And I think maybe that's a way they're improving the consumer's perspective.
What's also interesting to me, you think about, you know, that I actually trust more my Apple Pay than my credit card. You know, and you know, imagine that 5 years ago. You know, there's no way I would have felt that way.
Yeah,
I
for
mean,
sure.
I wonder why that. I mean, I know why that is. I definitely trust that more now, but it's also because if you think about the security model around credit cards, right? It's a totally shifted thing of liability and cost and whatever. Like, oh, the credit card will just pay, you know, whatever, and $50, whatever, you're liable for this amount, and the bank will handle this, because they're just dealing with such large amounts.
And all these payment, you know, point of sale devices. You know, I don't even trust putting my credit card in them anymore.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys have spent any time in like these POS systems, but like a Square, right? Like every time you make a charge, like in the POS system for that facility or that business, like it keeps a record of your name and your credit card number and like how many times you use your credit card there and all of that stuff. I'm sure they probably hash the credit card number and things like that, but like they're still tracking it based on this credit card number, right? Like it's that one piece of identifying information that they have to kind of track your history, whereas Apple Pay now just randomizes a thing, right? So it goes back to your PhD research where like, oh, if we can just randomize this, you can't track me as well. And it starts to, you know, obfuscate like what I'm doing, where I'm spending, things like that.
And that's what I like about it, is it essentially provides a one-time credit card number, you know. I mean, granted, they've done a lot of work, you know, and I can tell you, because we've rolled out, you know, we have payment point of sale devices across our entire retail enterprise, is, they've done a lot of work to ensure that payment chain is secure. And there's, compliance checks you have to do it every year and stuff like that. So, I mean, it is secure, but it is still, to your point, Jonathan, you are still using that same, number. It's not randomized at the source.
Right. I mean, the fact is, it's the same, whether it goes back to the credit card company or in Jonathan's, the Square is a great example of that. I mean, can't tell you the first time, like, it sort of occurred to me what happened, which was we went to like a Lego fair out in Reston, bought some Legos for my kids, paid with a credit card. They clearly, used a Square, whatever. And then a couple days later, I went and bought coffee at a different at a place nearby, and I got an email receipt to the email address I had given to the other company, because I use a different email address for every single vendor. And so I was like, wait a second, why did I just get this coffee receipt sent to this email address? And then I was like, oh, they must be using the same crap behind the scenes. And it was very frustrating. And I would much prefer to have just totally randomized credit card numbers, every single time, get a new virtual card for every single place. So yeah, I mean,
and then I think the problem with that is, how do you get them to remove that email from the system? Right.
Oh, it was a hassle.
So I had that problem similarly once. Tommy Thor, that you guys probably know, came to visit, and we went to somewhere to get tacos out of a food truck, and just happened to swipe my credit card and put in his email address. And so he starts getting email receipts every time I go back to that taco truck, which happened to be down the street from where I lived, and he was visiting. So he leaves, and now he's like, man, you eat a lot of tacos. And I was like, wait, what? And so I had to go I had to tell them that I needed to remove this email address. Right. But the problem is that employee that's inputting and selling stuff doesn't know how it works. So luckily I convinced her to turn the terminal around, let me go in, find my record in the POS system, and delete the email address. But that's a security risk right there. Because it's an iPad protected by 0000.
Right. So social engineering at play. And I think this also gets back to, to what Matt was saying, which is, I think larger retailers, I have much less concern when I go into large retailers about their POS. And I do always find it amusing that they're called POSs, because I think they're aptly named. But it's the smaller ones who are like, hey, I want to get up and running. And so I'm going to use this iPad and plug in this little device that plugs into my iPad and lets you swipe a credit card. And it's, blah, blah, blah as a service. It's, payment as a service. And it's a very different type of POS than, say, the Diebold machines and the rest of them that are really going in. Not suggesting that they're a good machine or a bad machine. They're just the first ones that came to mind, and the only ones I know of. But yeah, it's sort of interesting that it's, again, that sort of cost thing of those smaller companies aren't really concerned about your privacy. In fact, these loyalty programs, they're like, hey, yeah, let's use this third-party company who's going to run our loyalty program for us and do all of this stuff. And there's actually this crazy notion of I remember when I got that email, because it was sort of there was a shared loyalty program between all of the vendors that were using this one payment processor. And so I could earn points, buying tacos that would also, that would get me discounts on Legos, type of thing, which was not.
Sounds like the perfect combination. Sign me up. Yeah, and I think I hadn't even thought about the small businesses, because it's they're small businesses, they don't have this overhead to get these super advanced systems, but they're touching just as valuable of information that these very large corporations are touching, but the budget is nothing compared to a security budget at a large retail organization, right? And so I think that's an interesting attack vector that.
It's so cute that Jonathan thinks we have a large security budget.
Well, much more than the taco truck that, has one system, but yeah.
By percentage, it actually might be, percentage of gross. It might actually be about the same percentage. Which one of the things I was talking to some researchers who have seen that the percentage of your budget for security, it's actually got to go up, increase as you, it can't just be a percentage. It's actually got to be increasing. The more, the larger you are, the more you have to spend. It's not just a simple function of, 10% should go towards security. It's because as you get larger, you have more third parties, you're depending on more and more things. And it actually becomes an increasing cost as it relates to your overall revenues, which is always interesting.
I almost think that it needs to go up regardless, because if you look at, I like to use the military analogy because it makes sense to me, is, you look at the domains of land, sea, air, they're not growing. We keep the same amount of land, the same amount of air, the same amount of space. Oh, okay, you can factor in global warming and all that, but aside from that, cyber is growing at an exponential rate. It just continues to grow, and the barrier of entry is extremely low. So even if you do nothing at all, the attacks against your infrastructure just keep growing and growing. And so you've got to continue to just invest in improving it. And I think what you're seeing, especially with COVID, is it going the opposite direction. And so, there's no right way to answer that, because as a company's revenue goes down, they can't afford to spend as much on that stuff. But it's the reality, and meanwhile, the attackers are working from home too, so they got kind of more time on their hands, And
yeah,
so,
I wasn't trying to suggest that you should be spending, but in terms of I agree. You always need to be spending money. It's always based on that, right? But yes, I agree, and I also agree that that right now, with all of the shifts that have happened with COVID, there's more incentive. There's more people out of work. There's so many. The attack surfaces have increased. The number of attackers have increased, and
people are working remotely.
Right. And then on top of all of that, cybersecurity and all the risks and all, they continue to accelerate, and, at a pace that's, unprecedented. So of course, this is just really bad, right? Because there's just more people, more opportunity, and more incentive.
More IoT devices getting plugged into their home network that has their corporate computer on it now.
Doing schooling from home, and we all know that kids are, very security conscious.
Just mine, actually, so which is always funny because
actually, I believe that.
No, they totally are, right. My oldest is very funny, and he'll mention, can you believe the teacher has all of our passwords on a piece of paper in her desk? I was like, yeah, but it's to your Chromebook, and it's the school's property. But yeah. But yeah, I think there's the threat for IoT in terms of you being hacked, but I think also all of the potential for DDoS, just massive reflection and magnification of attacks on other systems where you yourself, you're basically, your network is getting slowed down, but really what's happening is all of your IoT devices have just been turned on to some other target, and so it has a small impact on you, the consumer, but really they're doing something really nefarious. And I think we've seen a very small percentage of IoT. There's a sleeping dormant giant out there, and we've only seen small attacks come from it. And it's just a matter of time before somebody harnesses it and really does something pretty devastating. Not to be too nihilistic, but that's my big fear when it comes to IoT.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of evidence for this, the Mirai botnet, and you just look at all these vulnerable, unpatchable devices that, I don't know what there was some, there's some article I read a couple years ago about, it was some vigilante who had written basically an exploit for a whole bunch of these unpatched end-A vulnerabilities. And a payload for it that just bricked the device. I don't remember what he called it, but essentially it was just scan the internet for vulnerable devices and brick them, because he's hey, if this is just hanging out on the internet, I'm not the only one that's doing this. I'm just going to take this thing off the internet for the greater good.
I'll tell you though that the chip in the Under Armour connected shoe does upgrade the firmware. So it is upgradable.
Well, hopefully it's not just sitting on the internet and this guy just goes out and bricks it for you.
No, but everybody should go out and buy like 7 or 8 pairs. Just because I said that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just waiting for it to like become a package on Kali Linux, and then Cybrary can just get hit by this IoT bot device, and that'll be a fun day for me, I bet.
I
Wow,
don't know
this
what
is
you
really
do
taking a
about it.
turn.
Yeah. I don't know what you do about that. It's like, it's almost like a common good problem, you know, when you think about, I think in a lot of ways, whether consumers are smart about stuff or not, they're like sort of they're operating at their own risk, right? So like if I'm not security conscious, I put some horrible device on my network and it gets popped, and then like I lose a bunch of, they pivot onto my laptop and I get like, you know, financial transactions or whatever, like I bear that cost. But like if you're just maintaining a bunch of unpatched devices in your home network that are they're going to continue to work even if someone like launches a botnet attack from them, like the counterparty that has to deal with the results of that is not the one that's like responsible for patching their device, if that makes sense. It's like, you know, I don't know how you solve that problem. It's like almost like pollution in a way, you know.
I have a scary vision of the future based on just what you said there, where basically insurance companies, like in order to get homeowners insurance or renters insurance, this is now going to be part of the policy, and they're going to be scanning your house and devices, and you're going to have to pay more if you have too many, or maybe they'll just, you can just pay them extra and they'll run the bot that automatically kills all of bricks your IoT devices for you to lower your liability.
It's funny, you start to see companies that offer cyber insurance having a war clause. You know, like if it's considered an act of war, they don't have to pay. Well, how do you figure a cyber attack isn't? And I mean, where do you draw that line? I mean, I think,
I'm sure it's at the insurance company's sole discretion, Matt.
Yeah. The best advice is steer clear of those.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've always, oh, go ahead, Jonathan.
What was that company? Wasn't there? So they've like kind of like thought about this, I think, right? Like if your router company is able to like detect a bot, like a global bot attack, right? And your router company can push an update like real quick over the air to shut down like anything on your network talking to this. I forget who it was. I think there was a company that like, I think it's like some of the ISPs, right? Like the ISPs sitting in their global NOCs start to see these attacks going, and then they just start cutting pipes. But I think if we could get down to like the lower like home router, like the Comcast one that's in everybody's house, or, whatever your main provider is, that I don't know, that's probably super tricky, right? Like it phones home and like, is responsible for filtering traffic on your network. Is probably a bad, but
I mean, I think it's cute that you think that they're not already doing that, but anyway. I'm sorry, right, Matt, what were you saying?
So I got it. So
no, I think it was Kaspersky and Huawei.
I got it though. I got this solved. So we're going to let the government put a backdoor on every device. And then when there's a problem, they can just go in and fix it.
I trust that.
Recurring theme.
I think we're done here. I think I think it's perfect.
Yeah, but they need to have single sign-on. They need to have single sign-on into your device.
I mean, who doesn't trust Bob at the FBI? I mean, come on.
Yeah. And on that note, all right, guys, great discussion today. Matt, it was great having you. Josh, always great having you back on the podcast. Mike, I see you every day. Still great seeing you on the podcast. So that wraps it up for this episode of the Cybrary podcast. Please check us out on the website, cybrary.com. Matt, you got anything to say? Closing arguments, things like that?
No, great. Thanks for inviting me. It's good chat, and good to see both you and Josh again.
It was very nice meeting you. It was nice meeting you, and I feel much better about going out and buying some Under Armour gear. So yeah,
buy lots.
And despite what you might believe, this podcast is not sponsored by Apple. So we just talk about it a lot.
Although it could be. I mean, if you're from Apple and you're interested in giving sponsorships.
It is that. All right, guys. Awesome. Great talking with everybody. Thanks. We'll see you guys next time.